Welcome to Securing the Future podcast with your hosts Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamaie, where we discuss the latest cutting-edge technologies and how they are affecting the security industry. Join us as we explore the latest advancements and discuss how these innovations are shaping the future of security. With Jesse, a skilled recruiter, and Ramin, a seasoned security leader, this is the show where industry expertise meets in-depth discussions.
All right, we're back for another episode of Securing the Future podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about security leadership, really getting back to the basics. As we all know, leadership is important in every industry. And today, we have a special guest, Wayne Dennis. Wayne, thanks so much for coming to the show and welcome.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, and as usual, my trusty co-host, Ramin Lamaie.
What's up, everyone?
All right. Little bit of background. Wayne is a senior executive security leader, kind of coming from the product and security engineering sector, kind of spent a lot of time in the consulting area, has worked with a lot of larger enterprise organizations, and so has really had a chance to see leadership, good and bad, right? As well as lead from the front. And so I know this is a passion for you, Wayne. I'm really excited about diving into this topic. You know, in every industry, and, you know, me being a small business owner, Ramin being a small business owner, like we understand and we've seen good and bad leadership, right? And security is kind of unique because it affects so many different people. You know, I guess to get started, you know, maybe anything you want to kind of kick off with, and then we'll go into some questions.
Yeah, I mean, so number one, I appreciate you having me, Jesse and Ramin. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here. And yeah, I'll just start by saying that, you know, I think there's a difference between leadership and management, right? I think a manager is a manager of people and a leader is a leader of all, right? So, you know, you don't necessarily have to be a manager to be a leader. Leadership comes in many different forms. And so, yeah, that's just kind of my personal opinion.
Yeah, no, great. What do you think, I guess is the first question, what do you consider the basics of effective cybersecurity leadership? And why do you think it's critical right now that we really start returning back to some of the basics?
Yeah, so I think the number one basic should be competency, right? You know, I think you should have an understanding of your domain, your chosen area of expertise, right? It's hard to be a leader without actually understanding, you know, the area. And this goes for analytics, this goes for engineering, this goes for HR. It has no discipline constraint, right? I think that, you know, you should have at least some knowledge of the area that you're supposed to be leading in. I think equally as important, and there's no real hierarchy here, some level of empathy, right? I think it's really difficult these days to connect with your people without having some level of empathetic, you know, perspective. Times are hard now. You know, unemployment is up comparatively. Jobs are getting harder to find, especially in tech. And so having that perspective, you know, just understanding that, you know, everyone's struggling, right? You know, whether they're employed or not, whether they're doing well or not, right? There's some level of struggle associated with that. And I think the best leaders can channel their empathetic, you know, side of themselves and connect with their people that way. And then the final is, I think, the bias to action, right? Being able to make a decision, execute. You'd be surprised how often some leaders don't really come in with the perspective around making an actual decision. And, you know, I think there's a difference between empowering your people, right, and giving them the options and the choices. I think that's super important. You know, we definitely want to empower our people to make the most effective choices possible, but sometimes it's up to you. And I think that this piece is somewhat forgotten amongst a lot of executive leaders, that at the end of the day, they have to be the ones to make the decision and own their decisions, right? Own the decisions that they make. Accountability is equally important in that sense, where when you make a decision, irrespective of the impact of said decisions, it's important that, you know, you own those decisions and you own whatever comes with that. And that's kind of what comes with being a leader, right? You know, that's the difference between someone that leads and someone that doesn't. That's my perspective on it. What are your thoughts, Jesse? I'm curious.
I think one of the things is, like, when you look at a cybersecurity leader in an organization, that person can be a great leader, but if they are not surrounded with other great business leaders, it makes their job even more difficult, right? And so I think we've seen that a lot, especially at public companies, you know, where you see a major breach happen and then it's the blame game, right? Those leaders are not willing to take responsibility for their role and their part to play in the lack of a breakdown of security. And then, the CISO becomes the scapegoat, right? Everybody puts blame and focus on that one person. Whereas, there needs to be, in my opinion, at least the spread of leadership responsibility for security across an organization. I don't know, Ramin, what are your thoughts on that too, from what you've seen in larger organizations?
Yeah, I would agree with you guys. And I would just kind of add two more traits, right? So one would be, a good communicator, right? Security is a very challenging role because a lot of times you're dealing with people that don't think like you do, right? They don't understand risk like you do. So you have to really bring the context to them, right? In their examples and their, niche in the world, right? And kind of give them examples of what those risks could look like, where they could go, right? So I think that's really important. And then the only other two I put down were like influence, right? Having the ability to influence, right? You can be the best security leader, but if no one, does what you, want to do, or, they're not influenced by your ability to lead, like you're useless, right? You're not impacting an organization. And then the last one I put down is just having the right mindset, right? Every organization I've worked with is different. If I went into every organization with the same mindset, I would fail every single time, right? So you have to kind of open yourself up whenever you're, in a leadership role to what does the situation look like? Who are the players? What are the rules to this game that you're going to be playing? And then figure out how to be effective in that role, right? And I've seen every situation just be different, even though, we're still kind of applying similar frameworks, similar type of tasks, similar kind of goals to reduce risk. But, with the different parameters, you have to really be an adaptive leader, right? And really figure out how to be effective in your situation and then be a really good communicator. I would say that's the only thing I would add to what you guys said.
Yeah, I think the next area that I hear a lot, right, especially when we're doing, like, let's say a search for a CISO or for a head of security, is understanding kind of for the CISO specifically, or for the security leader. It doesn't have to be, chief information security ops. It could be another role that's leadership within an organization for security. And Wayne, I guess this would be kind of a starting question for you, but how do you approach kind of the balance of the technical expertise that we know is necessary to understand the domain and the threat landscape and all of the factors, but then that combined with the leadership skills of actually leading a cybersecurity team?
I think communication, influence, et cetera, I think those are table stakes. So when I say things like competency, right, I think if we're talking about a CISO, right, I think we're past the point of debating whether or not a CISO is or should be treated as an executive level role. And so for executives, right, irrespective of whether or not you're, a senior VP or, C-suite, executives, there are certain things that across all competency domains I expect, right? I expect influence, I expect communication, clear communication. I expect baseline competencies, right? Those are things that I expect. I think the difference, right, between one executive to the next is their track record of decision-making and their impact. Right. That to me is kind of where I draw, or differentiate between one executive versus the other. So you asked a question around, balancing, the technical skills versus the business skills. I think it's insightful because, I think that, for a long time, the CISO role, right, has been considered a very technical role, right? It's been considered the super programmer or the super engineer, right? As it relates to cybersecurity, right? Someone that's supposed to know all, be all, and do all. And I think that over time, as the CISO role transitioned into more of an executive level capability, right, it's now become known as and identified as a business centric role. And with that business centric role comes all the traits and qualities that we discussed. And no less, right, is cybersecurity important, right, to have knowledge of as is finances to a CFO. Right. I expect baseline financial competencies, but I don't necessarily know that I need that person to be the smartest security engineer at the company. Right. That's not necessarily the case. I don't necessarily know that I need that CISO to be the deepest. I do expect a level of experience. I do expect a level of wisdom. I do expect a level of decision making that is appropriate for the right context. And I think that's part of the reason why I hold on so much to Ramin's words around mindset. Right. Are you bringing the right mindset? Can you context shift, right? Given the right organization, the mindset that you bring to an IR root cause analysis is a lot different than the one that you bring to a board readout, right? There's a level of getting down to the TTPs in one versus, the top 5 controls for the other, right? And I think that's super important to kind of differentiate and delineate. I think that the executive that does that is a true executive. The executive that can do that and communicate, right? Communicate clearly and influence clearly. That's the person that you want on your team, right? There are people that go deeper. Frankly, if you're the deepest person on the team as a CISO, then you're probably not the right CISO. In my opinion, that's a very personal opinion, right? That's probably not the right context, because there are people, frankly, that you want to go deeper. You want, the malware reverse engineers on your team. You want the hardware security engineers. You want those, the penetration testers, right? You want those individuals to be really good at their jobs, right? You want them to specialize. But for the CISO, right, and for the head of securities, if you will, right, you need them to be not necessarily generalists, right, but you need them to be jack of most trades, right? You need them to be able to context shift. You need them to be able to influence. You need them to be able to communicate. So for me, it's less of a question of, towing the line between being super technical and being super quote unquote high level, and knowing more of when to deploy both, right? When to deploy either. There are conversations that you need to be able to drive with your engineering leadership, right? And there are also conversations that you need to be able to drive with your board observers, your board members, and your C-suite, right? The CISO that can do both is the CISO that I need on my team.
Jesse, I have a question for you, right? From a recruiting background, how often do you find your clients to know what they need and then they fill that role with the right person? Like, is it a 50-50? Is it, 75-25? Because, it takes time to figure that out, right? And doing it in 2 or 3 interviews is really a difficult process.
Well, first of all, definitely never 2 to 3 interviews.
Show me the CISO size. That's 2 or 3 interviews.
Yeah. Touche interviews. It's a lot of interviews. That's a great question, actually. And one of the things I've learned is once you have, initially defined the need, right? And that could be head of security for a smaller org, which I do a lot of, to, CISO for mid-size to enterprise. I haven't done a lot of the enterprise searches, so those are different. And they're a little bit more nuanced because of the complexity of an organization, the size and scale. And I think, Wayne probably had more exposure to some of these larger organizations. But what I have seen is that there's initial defined, here's kind of what we are looking for. And then when you start to actually have the interviews, the client typically has some shifts in what they actually think they need as they start talking to, we call them talking to the humans, right? Like start having these conversations. And I would say that the majority of time, what we started with is never what we finish with when it comes to exactly what they said they wanted in the beginning. We may have a skeleton or somewhat, like 50 to 60% of what was initially talked about, but that rest of the, kind of archetype of that person can change a little bit, especially when it comes to the culture fit of whatever, their industry is, their culture is, what are some of their biggest concerns. I would say some of the things that stay the same are like, if it's an engineering-led company, finding someone who's had exposure to an engineering-led organization typically is a pretty good match, right? Because they understand the culture and the flow of business, right? If you're interacting with these teams on a regular basis, you need to think about what are the mistakes that engineers and those teams typically can make that could cause a security issue, as well as how does that get communicated up into the executive level. So I do with a lot of organizations that are more engineering-led, but I think when you're in a non-engineering-led organization, like Ramin and I have interviewed some folks from those kind of spaces, it's different. It's a different landscape. So understanding the industry you're stepping into to secure, I think has a big part to play. And like you said, Wayne, it's context. It's a lot of context to be able to understand how to communicate the business risks. So next question, as we kind of dig into, maybe more of the tactical of where we are today, right? The landscape is very different, right? I mean, infrastructure that we use as an organization is different with cloud infrastructure, public cloud, with all of the third parties that we have to worry about that integrate in our organization, third party risks, supply chain risk. There's a lot to communicate to the user. So Wayne, as a leader coming into an organization, we all know that educating the user is a really important part of a role as a security leader, because it takes everyone's work and effort and awareness to protect an organization. It's not just the CISO or that security team. How do you communicate that now and into the future? And what are some of the tactical things you found effective in being able to shift a culture of an organization to really take security seriously?
Yeah, so I want to make sure I understand your question, right? Are you talking about users in terms of corporate user, your internal, let's say your internal customer base, right? Employees? Or are you talking about users in terms of third-party consumers, right? People that consume your product, et cetera? Because the audience is different, right?
It is, yeah. More internal in this context would be, how do you lead the internal company and those users to protect the organization?
I think, the basics, right? Having a strong security awareness program is super important, and being able to leverage that program for the outcomes that you're looking to achieve, whatever KPIs, internal KPIs you might have set for success. I think that's super important. I think, and I've said this so many different times to different people, right? I think culture is set from leadership, and leadership from a top-down standpoint is how you set culture, right? It comes straight from the CEO. So if the CEO has prioritized cybersecurity as an imperative or a priority for the organization, then that's going to be manifested throughout the culture of the company. Similarly, right, as a CEO, right, if he or she sets the standard that, work-life balance is important for whatever, work-life harmony, right, that's trending.
That's a better word. Yeah.
Then that's going to be an expectation that's going to be encapsulated by, all the lieutenants and the SARs, trickling its way down. And I think that's important to note. It's the CISO's or the head of security's purpose to help drive, right, to help even evangelize, right? But it can't be done by just a CISO. And that's why executive buy-in at these levels is super important, right? That's why all the mini discussions, the micro interactions, the relationship building between the CISO and the C-suite and the CEO, right? Super important. Assuming all that's in place, right? Assuming all that's done, thinking about, how security impacts the user can be very helpful for a CISO, right? Understanding the extent and the impact to email security, for example, right? The number one threat vector for phishing, et cetera, right? Which is the number one root of compromise, no pun intended, as it relates to, intrusions within corporate environments. That's super important, right? Making that relatable to your audience, to your consumers, in this particular case, your employees, is instrumental, right, to getting not only understanding, but buy-in. Hey, this is all of our collective responsibility. So we all need to do our part, right? And in order for them to understand why it's their responsibility, they need to understand how it's a risk to them, right? And so that's a challenge for sure. It's definitely a challenge. I don't think it's like driving a discussion around the technicals around the edge, security endpoints and device security, and using language that isn't going to resonate with. So I think just making sure that you're evangelizing and making it relevant to the actual end user, I think
relevant. Yeah.
There's a lot of different ways that we can take it, right? But I think that at the bare bones, right, executive buy-in and making it relevant to corporate employees.
Yeah. The next phase, I think, that I want to kind of dig into is leadership development, right? Bringing on the next leaders into security, because great leaders develop other leaders, right? You can tell I've listened to a lot of John Maxwell in the past, but I think it's very true, right? And so my question would be, and this is kind of to both you and Ramin, what are some of the things that you were exposed to in your career, or that you went out and sought after, that helped you become a great leader, helped you have the right perspective on how to lead? Because they say leadership is caught, not taught. Was that the case for you, Wayne or Ramin? Or did you find that, you kind of learned it by actually going out and seeking help?
Ramin, you want to go first?
Sure. I would say, it's similar, as this is something I definitely think about a lot as a parent, that I have still younger kids where, I'm very much thinking about, how they learn, how they grow, right? How, can I enable them versus like hover and be overprotective, right? I think it's the same for leading an organization or people, right? You have to find the right balance of pull and push, right? One of the best ways that I learned was when I failed. I remember failing as a manager, where, the approach that I had, when I say failing, not necessarily meaning getting fired, but it was more intended in terms of my effectiveness, where, I was very effective as a manager level, for example, but I was terrible as a director, right? That was a shift in how I was to show up and what I was doing, and really changing that approach. And I learned, and I say it learned through failure, more than anyone else could have taught me. And I had the opportunity not only to fail in a safe, relatively safe way, meaning, I wasn't fired for it. I was given a mentor instead, right? So, then I was kind of armed with more of a tool, or, in this case, it was a person that I connected with where they can kind of help guide me, right? Because a lot of times, I think, Jesse, you and I have talked about this before, people get turned to management, but they have no idea how to be a manager or a leader, right? They're just really good at what they do, and management is like, hey, let's give them more responsibility, right? And when you do that, right, it doesn't just click for that person. That person has to shift and grow and learn, right? And it's, I relate that to kids as well, because you have to do the same with kids. You have to set them up in a safe environment where, you have to give them the room to try things, guide them where it makes sense, and then, let them grow from the experiences that they get.
I echo a lot of Ramin's thoughts. For me, and I don't know that I'm a great leader, right? I only know what people tell me, but I do think that I'm decent, right? And given that if I have any success at all, it's probably attributed to your point, Jesse, the leaders that I've had in my life. I don't believe that leaders are born. I don't. I do believe that leaders are bred, and there's a nuanced difference there. I was privileged and lucky enough to have some of the best leaders in the industry at every step of my career. There's no hyperbole there, right? I'm not exaggerating that at all, right? From my time in academia, at FRDCs, right, at Carnegie Mellon, to my time in consulting, even my time in nuclear, I've had some of the best leaders in the industry, right, to kind of mold and shape my perspectives. So I think I got lucky in that sense. I also think I think it's an attitude thing. I've always been a fairly intellectually curious person. I ask a lot of questions, and I just assume that I don't know anything. So when you kind of assume ignorance coming into a situation, it allows you to take away more from the situation. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to learn, right, something you didn't necessarily know before, but it does increase the chances of that happening. I just assume that I know nothing about the situation. So I think the combination of those two things, one that I can't control, right, who my leaders are, and one that I can control, right, my personality and my mindset coming into these, conversations and discussions and situations, I think those have been very beneficial. The third, and this is something that everyone can do, is get a mentor. A leader doesn't necessarily have to be someone that you work for. One of the things that I've been super intentional about is reaching out to people that have frankly done it before, right, that I can ask questions to and basically, lean on their failures, frankly, right, and their successes. If I could pick any one thing, probably the most impactful thing, it's very clear, I can see the traceability between, myself getting promoted at various points in my career based off of having a mentor, right? There were just things I just wouldn't have had access to and tap into. And I see a lot of people that are stagnant in their careers if promotion is important to them, right? Because they simply just lack the context of having someone to say, hey, here's how you do this. Here's how you navigate this. That's probably something I'm probably most grateful for, are my mentors. I think a nuanced perspective that I had to figure out, right? And this is something that they don't really teach you in mentor school, right? Is,
You had mentor school? Yeah, where do you go for that one?
It's a school of thought, right? But, mentor school where, the mentors that you have at one stage of your career is not quite the mentors that you're going to be able to lean on at another stage. So the mentors that I had when I was super technical, right, writing code every day and popping boxes and things like that are not the mentors that I had in my more managerial roles. And they're absolutely not the mentors that I had when I started making more a transition to an executive. And the mentors that I have, and I do think that there is a transition period, right? I think there are mentors that help you transition to an executive, and then there are mentors that help you maintain, right, your executiveness, whatever that is, right? I think, because their mentors are also in different parts of their lives as well. And your mentor should have mentors. If your mentor doesn't have a mentor, then, that relationship or that value probably will be short-lived. So that's something else to think about, right? Those are some of the things that kind of come to mind for me as what's helped me in my career.
The other thing I think we've missed, I want to make sure we touch on, is learning, reading, right? Leaders are readers. And I think if you want to progress into any type of leadership role, it's also about what do you consume? What do you read? At different levels, many times you'll read one book and then 5 years later, as you progress, you step back into that same book and you see it completely different, right? You learn new things from a leadership book, as an example. What were some books, maybe 1 to 2 books that you can remember, Wayne, that really were impactful to your growth as a leader?
Oh man, I feel like I'm giving away the gold here.
Secret sauce.
Sauce, man. This wasn't part of the agreement, Jesse.
Oh, sorry.
No.
If you don't want to tell us, that's okay.
No. So for me, right, it's 3 books actually. The first one was Beyond Cybersecurity. It was written by 2 ex-McKinsey partners on cybersecurity. I really appreciated that. I read that like before I got my start in cyber, and I think it shaped a lot of my perspectives as it relates to not only leadership, but cybersecurity and what good looks like. It even allowed me, I think, to even differentiate myself within consulting, within Big Four, frankly, right? By having a much more strategic as opposed to a controls-based or an assessment-based point of view. You learn things, right? Like what trade-offs look like, et cetera. And so, thinking like an owner, right? And servicing your customers that way, I think that's really important. The second one is called On Strategy. It's a book by HBS. Basically, all of the HBS case study books are really good, but particularly On Strategy. I think that one was really instrumental in terms of how to address organizations that are going through all sorts of things and dealing with those cases on a case-by-case basis, right? Really getting into how to think through business problems. It has nothing to do with cybersecurity. Nothing to do with cybersecurity, at least practically, right?
Yeah.
But I probably bring more of a strategic perspective, again, early in my career than now. And so that's just something that I think, for me is super, super helpful, super impactful. The third is, and I think this is just recommended reading for everyone, right? Everyone should read this book, How to Win Friends and Influence People.
Oh, yes. Book.
That's just table stakes, right? If you read no other book, read that, because it'll save you a lot of time and kind of, knocking your head against the wall. And you can tell who's read it and who hasn't, frankly. For me at least, I can tell, right? Or at least
I agree.
Not necessarily who's read it, but who's learned the lesson, right? And I think I read that more of like this is a lesson that I should probably learn. For me, someone that has a very strong personality, I needed that book, right? That book definitely served me. And so I would recommend that to anyone coming up or, anyone that hasn't read it.
Yeah. So. Funny, I just recommended that to a group of Full Sail University students here in Orlando. I said, if you're going to read any book as a security engineer, security analyst, whatever level you start out, read that book, because you need to deal with people and you need to understand how to deal with conflict and how to win people to your perspective in a way that makes them feel special and important, and learning how to save face, or not save face, I should say. Yeah, all of those key lessons are great. So those are good books. Ramin, what are your any books for you that were kind of career defining, or that you just like, man, I read this and it really helped me?
Yeah, I listen to a lot of books. I don't read as often, but listen to a lot of books. I've listened to a lot of leadership books, and there's a lot of good ones that stick out. I think one that I remember probably the most is Turn the Ship Around by David Marquet. It's a really good book about leader-follower model, and then turning that into like a leader-leader model where you more empower the people that work for you. And the example is actually, it was a real life example of like a naval officer being assigned like the worst performing submarine in like a fleet, and then turning it around to be kind of, the most successful. And then that model of leadership being adopted by the US Navy, right? So through his example, through his leadership, they completely shifted the way that the Navy operated after that. And I think the example of, we've already kind of hit on it, you're turning, other people into leaders and empowering them is the best way, right? Because the challenge that I see, especially in cybersecurity, is, we want to be the smartest person in the room. We want to be, the decision maker. So it goes against the grain when we let go of that control and we empower others to be in those roles, right? So it was definitely a shift for myself, going through my career, working at a Fortune 500 company. And even now, as I do consulting, I find myself daily in a situation where I don't know these leaders that I'm talking with. Very quickly, I need to build trust, and very quickly, I need to be effective, right? To help shift the direction that they want to go, or, what outcomes they're trying to achieve. And I have found, going in, being that disruptive person and, call everyone, out on their bullshit doesn't work. Even though, you can sense, there are challenges and there's issue, you still have to figure out, your strategic, approach where you can help empower people, you can bring to light, where there are issues and other things, and let other people also chime in, right? And see that and then help guide people in the right direction. So I found that book to be really good. Another one that came to me as well, and I think it's one of the most cheesiest books, and I almost don't want to recommend it, but it's because it's cheesy that I remember it. It's called The Leader Who Had No Title by Robin Sharma. And it's a cheesy book. It's like a fiction book based on like the philosophy of good leadership, right? So imagine, being in a situation where, there's this person that's helping solve everything, but they don't want credit. They don't want, the leadership title. They're not in it for money. They're there just to help. And it's a really interesting concept, right? Because to me, when I first became a manager, it kind of went to my head very quickly, right? I was reaffirmed about all the, the strengths that I had, right? And I focused and doubled down on those, but I didn't really, understand some of my weaknesses, right? Like, leading versus, micromanaging, right? Some of those aspects. So the idea of, being kind of more in the background, not looking for credit, not looking to, be acknowledged for everything and letting your team be in the spotlight was a complete shift in my mindset, right? And, hearing this cheesy book still to this day, like the examples in there stick with me, right? Even in my consulting days now, as I work with people, I will disappear, in these scenarios very quickly, but the people that I'm leaving there, I want to empower them. I want them to be in the spotlight, right? And that's really a good philosophy to follow as you think about how to lead, right? Because that leaves an impact to me. If I go in and I do an amazing job and I leave, right? If I don't turn that over and I don't have that organization going, more self-sustained, where's the value that I bring in that situation? It's kind of how I think about it.
That's great. Oh, I love it. I feel like we've covered some really good lessons today on just simple things around leadership. And it's important to maintain that thought that how important that really is, right? Because if everyone takes ownership as a leader, you're going to have a much more secure organization, right? I mean, there's the reason we call it the security champion in an engineering team, right? Where you're taking a person, you're empowering them, you're training them, and you're telling them, here's areas you can take responsibility for security. And sometimes I've seen people build great security programs on a shoestring budget without having any real team dedicated. What they've done is they've empowered leaders within different groups to take the responsibility. And it makes you feel like, wow, okay, I've got this responsibility now and I'm making an impact. And I think we can do more of that as we continue to see these threats become more complex, more challenges out there with the landscape changing. Simple leadership, right? Simple empowering new leaders, staying humble, don't letting things get to our head where we have to be the smartest person in the room, like, has been mentioned today. I think these are great lessons learned. So Wayne, we really thank you so much for taking some of your time to come on and share your wisdom and what you've learned and, what you've been instilled from great leaders that have helped you. And we hope that this would inspire many that are out there to give back, and for those who are looking to become a leader, get a mentor. Like Wayne said, I totally agree with that. That's a very important thing. Read, find great books where you can learn what other people have already learned and then now implement it and create that right mindset. So any last thoughts, Wayne, before we go?
Like, follow, subscribe. No, thanks for bringing me on board. This has been fun. It's been really, really fun. I've enjoyed the discussion. Ramin is a wealth of information. I thoroughly enjoy. I actually, while you were chatting here, I just put your book recommendation to my Amazon cart. The Leader Who Had No Title. I actually am a really big fan of that. I don't like the spotlight, frankly, and so, and that's part of my mantra. My inner mantra is to help enable others. So I'm curious about this book, and I'm gonna pick it up. But yeah, this has been fun.
Definitely, we'd love to have you on again. Well, thanks guys
so much, Manny. Appreciate you.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Have a great day, all. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Securing the Future podcast with your hosts, Jesse Meadors and Ramin Lamaie. If you enjoyed, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a rating.